Okay, good morning, everyone. So we were looking at the issue of the Ikrim, the Yud Gimel Ikrim, and the broader context of this was the status of non-believers and, well, of course, non-Jews in Olam Haba, because we were discussing the world of reward and punishment and the various components to it, and out of that came this question of what the status of someone who isn't a Ma'amin, someone who isn't a believer is. Now, I mentioned last week we did a very brief survey of the Gaonim and the Rishonim on the topic. We saw that the Rambam is the first one, almost the first one, to systemize a list of beliefs, things that one has to believe in order to be a Ma'amin. On the one hand, the Rambam is really basing himself on a collation of Gemaras, as is always the case with the Rambam. Rambam doesn't really make up these things. He combines them with, he brings them out from the various earlier sources, from Sukkim and Sugyas and the like. On the other hand, there isn't a clear and systematic source that really predates the Rambam, and there certainly isn't a Gemara which sort of systematically, in the manner that the Rambam does, goes through all these sources and says, this is what a Jew has to believe, and if one does believe that, then one is a Ma'amin, and if one doesn't, one isn't a believer. So this is the first sort of question on the Rambam. We also saw that the critics of the Rambam argue on several counts. There are those that tweak the list, who says this is in the list, who says this isn't in the list, exactly what do you include in the list, what don't you include in the list. But then there's a broader set of criticisms which really don't understand the whole idea of Ikrim Emunah. I mean, a Jew has to believe everything in the Torah. We've got 613 mitzvahs. I understand not everyone always lives up to them, but basically speaking, this is what you have to do, and if you do that, you're fine, and if you're not, you're not. Where do we get this whole concept of Ikrim Emunah? What do we mean by the idea of fundamentals of faith? And we saw this is one of the attacks, one of the criticisms, and the whole concept, the whole project that the Rambam embarks on in formulating principles of faith. We'll get back to that. We also saw various questions about to what degree is everything the Rambam says in his various works consistent. The Rambam in his Mishnah Torah doesn't quite say the same as he says in his commentary to the Mishnayos, which really is the first source of the concept of the Yud Gimel Ikrim. And then we saw that the various summaries of the Yud Gimel Ikrim, two of which are most famous, the Ani Ma'amin formulation and the Yigdal, the Piyut, the song, the Yigdal, the poem Yigdal. And both of them, by definition, are summaries and therefore need to be treated with care. The definition of a summary is that you include some things and exclude others. So that was the sort of a lay of the land, the issues we need to look at. But let's just take them now one by one and try and work through them and see what we can make of all of them. And the first and most important question is, what is the concept of an Ikka? What do we mean when we say something is an Ikka? Surely one has to believe everything that the Torah says, and if one doesn't, then one isn't believing what the Torah says, and if one does, one does. So what does it mean to define one thing as an Ikka and a second thing not as an Ikka? To put this more starkly, the Rambam himself in Ikka number 8, and here I'll read the shortened version from the Ani Ma'amin formulation. The Rambam himself in Ikka number 8 says, Ani Ma'amin, b'emunah shlema, shekol ha'Torah matzuyat b'yadenu. That the whole Torah which is found in our hands, is that which is given to Moshe Rabbeinu Olav Hashalom. So the whole Torah as we have it is given to Moshe. And in number 7, the Rambam says, again in the Ani Ma'amin formulation, Ani Ma'amin b'emunah shlema, shenavus Moshe Rabbeinu hoisamitis, that the prophecy of Moshe is true. So if you combine these two principles together, basically a Jew is obligated to believe that everything in the Torah is true. So once you believe that everything in the Torah is true, what's the whole concept of the 13 principles of faith? You have to believe everything in the Torah is true. So you might as well list that the story of Korach is a 14th principle of faith. Because if you don't believe the story of Korach, that means you're not believing a part of the Torah. And the Rambam said in principles 7 and 8, in combination, that we have to believe everything in the Torah is true. So what's the point of the remaining 11, 12 Ikrim? Once we have the principle, everything in the Torah is true, that's it. Which is really the attack of the critics of the Rambam against him, which is either there's no such thing as an Ikka, or everything is an Ikka, but there's no in between. There's no 13 things which are principle, more important than anything else? So this is a well-known question on the Rambam, and I think the clearest answer to this question is found in a catchphrase of Reb Chaim Brisker, Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, who dealt with this. And we don't have this recorded in the name of Reb Chaim himself. We don't have a text, a writing, a piece of work from Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, Reb Chaim Brisker himself, who deals with this. But many of his students reported that when he discussed this idea, this is what he said. And he discussed it in particular on the question of the Ravad, the critic of the Rambam, the Ravad Rabbi Avram ben David, a provincial sage and scholar, a contemporary of the Rambam, who wrote critical notes on the Rambam, on his Mishnah Torah. And when the Rambam lists the 13 principles of faith, I mentioned this critique of the Ravad last time. On the one that says that God has no body, the Ravad says there's Rabbim v'Tovim menu, there's greater and better than him, or perhaps than us, who do believe that Hashem had a body. Who exactly the Ravad is referring to, maybe we'll see in future weeks. But the Ravad is saying there are great figures who took the language of the Psukim and the Midrashim literally. After all, if you read the Torah talks about Hashem having a Yod Chazaka, strong hands, Roy and Tziyah, an outstretched arm. So even the Torah itself seems to describe God with bodily form. Now we know, and the Rambam emphasizes this, and this is certainly accepted, that these are metaphor. This is language that's used. However, says the Ravad, you can't blame people who are misled by what they see in the Psukim and the simple meaning of the verses and in the Midrashim. We know the Midrash is full of even more allegorical or metaphorical use of language, which seems to be very clear in describing Hashem with bodily form. And the Midrash is poetical. Midrash uses analogy and metaphor to describe things. And these people take this literally. So the Ravad is not aligning himself with the camp that say that God has a body. He says this is a mistake. This is a terrible mistake. But you can't call someone a heretic for making such a innocent mistake. This is the question of the Ravad on the Rambam, which really brings out another question over here, which is, besides the question, the problem we've already asked of what is this idea of 13 principles of faith, where do the classic formulations of shogeg and mezid and ones come in? Now we know in halacha that there are broadly speaking, three levels of responsibility, culpability you can face for things that we do wrong. One can be mezid, one can deliberately do it wrong. So I'm driving my car down the road and I see someone I don't like, and I floor the accelerator and I head towards them and crash into them to take them out. So this is an act of ritzicha, of murder b'mezid. I'm driving along and I'm perhaps haven't maintained my car, and therefore the brakes aren't very good. I haven't done my MOT for a couple of years, or maybe I'm texting while I'm driving and I crash into the person. I'm not completely innocent. On the other hand, I didn't deliberately set out to kill them, so I'm not mezid, but I am shogeg, a very serious case of shogeg. In this case, it would be a shogeg korov lemezid. It's a peshia, it's a devastating act of negligence. On the other hand, it wasn't a deliberate murder. And then there's ones, an accident that happens completely beyond my control, something for which I'm not in the least responsible for. It was completely beyond my control. Perhaps a car crashed into me and threw my car forward into someone else. And in such a case, I am completely innocent. So these are classic categories. So what about applying these categories to these laws of an apikoros? After all, being an apikoros, and we'll see this in more detail later, is not just an abstract theological position. It has real consequences. It has consequences according to the Rambam in the world to come, but it also has consequences in this world, in one's halachic status, and whether one is a part of the Jewish people or not. One remains Jewish, but whether one has the rights and privileges of a member of the Jewish people or not, whether one can make up a minyan, whether one can call the Torah, whether one, and so on and so forth. So this is a sort of another formulation of the attack on the Rambam, which is, where do the normal, the Ravad is asking this question. He says, you call someone an apikoros because they're not as deep as a thinker as you are, Rambam, because they're not as philosophically minded, because they take the Torah and mitzvahs, the psukim in the Torah, the language of the psukim and the Midrashim, literally, and for that reason you call this person a heretic. This is a terrible thing. So an attempt at answering these questions on the Rambam was given by Reb Chaim Brisker, and I think he doesn't need my agreements. He's a great Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, but I think we can agree that what he says is absolutely right in the Rambam, and very logical, has a sound basis to it, though we will have to see how to tweak this, how to explain this, how to understand this in a broader context. But the answer Chaim gave to this is a phrase in Yiddish that he's quoted by many of his students as saying, in which he said, Nebuch an Apikoros is oich an Apikoros. Nebuch an Apikoros, an Apikoros who is innocent, who's Nebuch, who through no fault of their own ended up as a heretic, but nonetheless is still a heretic. Meaning to say that an Apikoros in the thinking of the Rambam is an existential concept. It's a state of being. It's not about blame over here. It's not about guilt. When we look at criminal culpability, liability for damages, responsibility for averos and sins, they're the categories of shogeg and mazid and ones, deliberate and accidental and on purpose and by mistake. Makes sense. However, here we're not talking about culpability. We're talking about reality, existential reality, spiritual reality. Am I or am I not a believer in what we call Judaism? Now, it may not be my fault that I don't know something, but if I don't and I don't believe it, then I'm believing in a different system that's not Judaism that I believe in. And this sort of helps us crystallize what the Rambam meant by calling something foundations of faith. Let's say I go through life, and I happened to have been away in year 3. I was under the weather, I had the flu in year 3 in a particular week, and I never heard the story of Korach. And at age 75, someone comes to me and says, I want to tell you the story of Korach. I say, Korach? Never heard the man. Tell me about him. And they tell me the story of Korach, and I say, well, I wasn't taught that in school. Don't believe in it. Never heard of such a thing. So is the religion I'm believing in not Judaism? I'm still a believer in Judaism. There's a piece of information I'm missing. Imagine, however, tragically, I was away in year 1, in the 3rd week of school, and I missed them telling me that God is one. And at age 75, someone tells me, Judaism believes that God's one. And I say, never heard that. I think there's a dozen of him. So the Rambam here is arguing, this isn't your fault, but this simply isn't Judaism that you believe in. Someone who doesn't believe in one God, someone who thinks there's many gods, this isn't a question of blame, but the fact is they have adopted a pagan stance. This isn't Judaism that they believe in. As opposed to other pieces of information in the Torah, if you happen not to know, you happen not to know, but it's not a defining feature, a defining quality of Judaism. Belief in God, belief in the Torah given to Moshe, this is what it means to say I'm Jewish. If you don't believe in that, then it's not your fault, maybe, but you're believing in something else. It's a different faith, different religion, different system. As opposed to other pieces of information outside these 13 principles of faith in the thinking of the Rambam, if you don't know them, you happen not to know them, there's a piece of information you're missing. It's very sad, there's a part of Torah you don't know. But you're just simply missing a piece of Torah. It's not the parameter, it's not the skeleton, it's not the framework, it's not the outside delineation of the shape of Judaism. And therefore, without it, I'm still a participant in Judaism, I'm still a member of Judaism, I'm still believing in Judaism. They're just certain pieces of information that I don't know. So if someone knows that the Torah tells us the story of Korach and decides not to believe in it, then the Rambam says, you fall foul of fundamental 7 and 8, which says that you have to believe everything that the Torah says, not to deny the authenticity of the Torah. But if I have no idea about the story of Korach, I've never heard of it, I'm not denying the authenticity of the Torah, I just don't know it. So in that case, innocent, not your fault, you didn't know it. Someone who knows everything about Judaism and happens not to know the Korach story, still believe in Judaism. However, if I'm missing one of the principles of faith, like belief in monotheism and one God and things like that, don't believe that God made the world or something like that, then I'm missing a basic principle, a delineator, a framework, a skeleton, a structure that defines this as Judaism. So the project of defining, according to the Rambam, the 13 principles of faith is a massively important one. It's finding what do we mean when we say I believe in Judaism. Someone who says, I'm Jewish, I believe in Judaism. What do those words mean? They can't mean every detail of every halacha in Shulchan Aruch, or every line or verse in the whole of Tanakh. Who knows these things? Some of us know them, some of us don't. We don't. That doesn't mean that that's not Judaism. But to be Judaism means that I believe in this structure, these 13 principles of faith. So argued Reb Chaim in the Rambam. This is what he means by the 13 principles of faith. Now, this answer, I think, is very coherent. It makes a lot of sense. It helps us understand what the Rambam was doing. And it also now allows us to join into the conversation and now try and question, so what are these principles of faith? We've now, if we hear this point, we've now entered the worldview of the Rambam. We've understood there's defining features. We've answered the critics, that Abarbanel, who says, what do you mean there's 13 principles of faith? Just the 613 principles of faith, if you like. It's just the whole Torah as the principle of faith. We understand why he says there's principles of faith. And now we have to discuss which ones are. I mean, some of them are obvious, some of them are less obvious. I think we can all understand why if you happen not to know that there's one God, it may not be your fault, but that's not Judaism that you're believing in. However, if you happen not to know about Mashiach or about Tchias HaMesim, why would that be an Ikka? Why would that be a fundamental of faith? So now we can engage in the sugya, in the topic of the Rambam. And we can argue and we can discuss and try and work out why, in his understanding, in his hashkafa, these 13 are based upon the sources he draws out from the Gemara, from the Psukim, why these 13 are principles of faith. But at least we understand the terms we're using, what we mean by the concept of a principle of faith. Whereas without this, we wouldn't understand what makes this a principle of faith. Surely you just have to believe in everything. So this is a very standard formulation of Chaim, and I think it's a very good one. And now we understand the Rambam's response to the Ravid. The Ravid says there are Rabbi Matomi, there are many good, sincere people that read the Torah, and they're not as philosophically minded as the Rambam, and they take it literally. Torah talks about God's hands and God's outstretched arm, and they think God has a hand and an arm. The Rambam's response would be, I feel very sorry for the people, I'm not blaming them. But unfortunately, if you see God as physical, that's not Judaism that you're believing in. That's not our picture of what we mean by God. Not enough to say I believe in one God and not know something about what that word God means. So this would be the Rambam's answer to the Ravid. And now a fruitful conversation in the start. Does it really matter if you think that God is a body? Why should it matter so much? Why is this such an integral element and feature of the principles of faith? But at least we understand what we mean when we're discussing principles of faith. The concept of principles of faith, first delineated and made most clear by the Rambam, is the idea that they define what it means to be a believing Jew, what Judaism is, what is this thing Judaism that we believe in, that we are part of. Now we can go and discuss whether these parameters are correct or incorrect. Where did the Rambam get this idea from? The answer is he read it in a Mishnah. He understood it to be what the Mishnah is saying. Because the Mishnah, and really this is the Mishnah in which he wrote it, his commentary to the Mishnayos, as we said, is an introduction to the 10th or 11th Perek of Sanhedrin, Perek Chelek, which discusses who does and doesn't have a place in the world to come. And the Mishnah opens with Kol Yisrael Yeshem Chelek B'nei Mabah. All of Yisrael have a portion in the world to come. And then it carries on, Ve'elu she'einem Chelek B'nei Mabah. And these are those who don't have a portion in the world to come, including the one who denies in the concept of Olam Haba. So the Rambam says, what do you mean? Every Jew has a portion in the world to come, and these are those who don't have a portion in the world to come. And then it lists a principle of faith. You see, there are certain beliefs that remove the name Israel from the person. There are certain non-beliefs, certain ideas which are definitional. They define what it means to be a participant in the Jewish faith. And if you don't have them, then you're outside the Jewish faith according to the Rambam, and therefore one doesn't have a portion in the world to come. So this is point number one of the Rambam, that he argues that this is what the Mishnah means. Point number two is that in the Rambam it's all about ideas. This is very Rambam, this is very Maimonidean. It's not about behavior. One can be a murderer and a terrible human being. Rambam is not condoning murder. Absolutely terrible human being, a very deeply flawed individual, but still someone who is part of the Jewish people, albeit a terribly flawed member of the Jewish people. However, it comes to wrong beliefs. The Rambam says this is outside the pale. This means that what one is part of isn't the Jewish belief system. So the Rambam can be forgiving of mistakes. The Rambam can be forgiving even of terrible sins. Certainly when it comes to the world of sins, there's mazid, there's deliberate, there's shogeg, there's mistaken, there's ones, where it's not at all your fault. And even mazid, okay, people mess up sometimes, people do terrible things. But beliefs, that in the Rambam's view, that means that one is part of isn't Judaism. It's not about fault. In the language of the Reb Chaim, the evocative language of Reb Chaim in Yiddish, never chnapikos is oichnapikos. It's not fault. This person is not to blame. However, the fact is that one believes in or doesn't believe in isn't Judaism if one doesn't know this information. So this is Reb Chaim's reading of the Rambam, and it gives one, I think, a clarity of what the Rambam at least is saying, that we're now going to have to understand. How do we relate to this? How do we connect to this? How do we apply this? The questions we asked last week, how do we deal with others, our family, our friends, our near, our dear, or perhaps even ourselves, who sometimes go through times of ups and downs in our ummah, and this is human nature. We struggle, we're on a journey of spirituality. How do we live with a seemingly very black and white, harsh picture of the Rambam? So this is the Reb Chaim's answer to, at least we understand what the conversation is about the Rambam, though we still need to understand what the Rambam put in to this list of 13 beliefs. I'll pause there for a minute in case there are any questions, because I think this is a very important first stage in speaking about the Rambam and understanding what's going on over here.
Rabbi, so when the Rambam's trying to formulate some principles, it does appear as if there's sort of a sort of thematic view. There's sort of a level of detail. Some things seem to go into more detail than others. It's a very big picture, belief in Hashem, which says kind of should be axiomatic of any monotheistic religion. And then quite a few that sort of delve into sort of more minutiae about the Torah, about Moshe, about all that sort of thing. It sort of seems like, I don't know the details of the Mishnah that talks about Olam Haba, but is there actually an equivalence between the list that the Mishnah gives about those who don't have Olam Haba and the list that Rambam provides, because they seem to sort of operate at different levels?
Yeah. Okay. So this is a very, very good question. The Rambam in his Mishnah, I'll answer the question on two levels, and I only partially know the answer to your question. It's something that bothers me very deeply. The Rambam, those who came after the Rambam pointed out that basically the 13 principles can be divided into three clusters. Cluster number one is belief in God, including that God is one, not two, that God it doesn't have a body and things like that. Cluster number two is belief in Torah and prophecy. God communicates to us. And cluster number three is to do with reward and punishment and God's awareness of what's going on. Those are basically, if you look at the principle of faith, those are those three clusters. So that's the first point. There is a sort of theme around the 13 principles of faith. The Rambam in his Mishnah Torah does use language which seems to indicate that some are more fundamental than other. He'll say things like Yesod HaYesodus. So the Hebrew word for principles of faith isn't just Ikrim, but also Yesod, a foundational belief. And then the Rambam will say Yesod HaYesodus, the foundations of all foundations, is belief in a God who brought the whole world into existence. So he does seem to have some sort of hierarchy. We'll talk about Ikar HaGodol, this is the great principle. So he does seem to delineate a hierarchy. Nonetheless, there's no getting away from I don't call this a problem in the Rambam, because I think the Rambam does mean this, but I find it very difficult, that it would turn out, according to the Rambam, if you believe in 12 of the 13 principles of faith, seemingly, and you happen not to believe in the 13th, you believe in one God, and you believe in Torah, you don't believe in Tchias HaMetim, you have a particular problem with that. It seems in the Rambam like it's all worthless then, it's all useless, because you're not believing in all 13, so sorry, that's just not Judaism you're believing in. And that's very troubling. I think all of us would find that very troubling and very difficult. And what are the conclusions of this? Does the Rambam mean to say then that it's all pointless because one doesn't have everything? Now we understand in the world of mitzvahs, and this is an absolute classic of every rabbinic sermon and every kiruv speech and everything else. It's not all or nothing. You don't have to keep everything. Somebody who smokes 60 a day, it's still advantageous to move down to 20 a day. It's in mitzvahs, it's not all or nothing. If you're, Rosh Hashanah and every Teshuvah speech, pick one thing and try and grow in that. You can't build, Rome wasn't built in a day. You can't build up everything. In the world of mitzvahs, everyone understands that. It's true that we all have to keep all mitzvahs. On the other hand, humans are humans, and we need to build up slowly. And it's understood that keeping something is better than keeping nothing. And the Rambam himself says this. Comes to Ikrim, the Rambam is of the belief that if you don't have them all, then that's not Judaism that you're believing in. It's simply you're not B'chlal Yisrael in terms of your belief. And therefore, in sort of answer to your question, Neil, whilst it may be that some are more primary than others, nonetheless, they're all primary enough that they all matter in the thinking of the Rambam. And I find that a very difficult idea. Good. So that's do they map
across to the list in the Mishnah? Can you sort of say, well, there's either thematically 3 topics for those who don't have a Olam Haba, or there's 13, or there's 25, or 6, whatever it is.
Okay, so I hadn't planned to talk too much about this, but I'll just very briefly answer your question because it deserves answering. Where did the Rambam get these 13 from? The answer is they are not found in that Perek in Chelek. The Rambam collates using what we know he knew how to do, his incredibly encyclopedic knowledge of Tanakh and Shas, along with his brilliance as a very systematic thinker, and he draws out psukim and chazals all over Shas, and we know that Gemara is Shas is scattered. It's not organized in a way that we would like it to be, and the Rambam set his task to be the great organizer. It's exactly like if you learn through Hilchos Shabbos, when you learn the Rambam, it's machaya, it's an absolute pleasure. It's all systematic, it's organized. You learn Gemara and it's all over the place. But the Rambam, every halacha the Rambam says, the Rambam at least thought he had a source for it. What do I mean he thought he had a source for it? I mean, other thinkers, and sometimes even practical halacha, we may not follow the Rambam. We may argue that there's a different reading in a Gemara, or that he misunderstood the source, or there's different ways of resolving things, whatever one might do. But the Rambam went through his understanding of the classic sources and drew out of them practical halacha about Hilchos Shabbos from a scattered collation of sources all over Bavli and Yerushalmi and all the halachic works. So he does exactly the same with the 13 principles of faith. He is of the opinion, he's convinced that every single one of the 13 principles of faith, he says, is absolutely clear in a pasuk or a mishnah or a gemara or a medrash somewhere. However, there's no systematic record of anyone else who goes through and tries to make a systematic list. The list in the chapter of Chelek in Olam Haba, which the Rambam is starting with, is not systematic even remotely so in this manner. Nonetheless, the Rambam argues he has sources for all these 13, and in that respect, I'm not going to be in the business of arguing the Rambam about that, but others did, including the Ravid and including the Sefer Ikrim and the Abarbanel and many other thinkers. Okay, so what we're left with is this Rambam. We're left with a very beautiful exposition of the Reb Chaim Brisker to help us understand what the Rambam is saying, and a very tough message inherent in this.
Can I just ask? Sorry, if we're saying blame doesn't matter, and the categories of ones, shogeg, and mazid don't apply, then if someone doesn't believe in one of the Yud Gimel Ikrim, for example, they're Tinuk Shenishba, they were never taught it, we're saying that the consequence of that is they don't have. Are we saying the consequence is they don't have Olam Haba according to Perek Chelek? I mean, if it's not their fault, they were left out of school that day or whatever it is, what are the consequences of all of this that's different to not doing a particular mitzvah where you don't get particular schar or onesh or something?
Okay, so I'm going to put on hold the words Tinuk Shenishba that you just threw in, because that's the next topic I want to get to. But leaving that aside, if we have someone who falls into the category of a heretic according to the Rambam, i.e. non-believer in whatever that exactly means in these 13 principles. And again, we will modify this in future shurim, so please bear with me in this. But at this stage, the Rambam says someone who isn't a believer loses, in some respects, their status as Yisrael, which means that Ein Lahem Chelek L'Olam Haba, that's the Mishnah in Chelek, that's a Mishnah. They don't have a portion in the world to come, and they lose some of their rights here in Olam Hazeh that are part of being a member of Klal Yisrael. As I said, they can't form part of a minyan and various other things. They lose their halachic status in some respects as Yisrael, as a member of Klal Yisrael. Though we will look at this further, but that's what the Rambam says in his Mishnah Torah, and that's what he says in Parashas Mishnayos as the consequence of being a non-believer. However, your question does introduce a new concept, the idea of a Tinuk Shenishba, the captured child. And this is an important idea. And in fact, we're going to have to ask how this idea fits with this very neat explanation of Chaim Brisker that we've just said. And the source of this is a Rambam in Hilchos Mamrim. The word Mamrim means rebels. There is a pasuk ruling in the Torah, and this is gives rise to a whole section of halacha in the Rambam, about a Zokein Mamri, an elder who rebels, meaning to say one of the Sanhedrin who refuses to bow to the majority opinion. The Sanhedrin functions based upon the view of Rav, and if you have a Zokein who refuse to accept this halachic opinion, they are Zokein Mamre and in contempt of court with the most serious consequences possible. Now, the Rambam, in his Laws of Rebels, in his Hilchos Mamrim, says that someone who doesn't accept Torah Sheba'al Peh, this isn't a Zokein Mamri, this is a heretic. A Zokein Mamri is someone who is a member of the Sanhedrin, but doesn't accept the majority rule. He's convinced he's right. and refuses therefore to bow to the majority who he is sure is making a mistake. And that's a legal problem. How can you have a functioning of a legal system when people aren't willing to bow to the law? Argue all you want in the deliberations, but once the law is determined, the law has to operate in a manner. A Zokin Mamre, a judge in the Sanhedrin, can't continue to defy the majority opinion, or that's the road to chaos. So the Rambam is of the view, sorry, the halacha is clear. This is a Zokin Mamre. So the Rambam, this is referring to someone who is in principle a member of good repute, someone who is believing in the system. However, someone who denies the whole concept of the oral Torah, a Sadducee or sorts of something like that, that's not a Zokin Mamre, that's a heretic. But then the Rambam carries on, and he says that, as we said, he's not considered a member of the Jewish people. Eino b'chlal Yisrael. They're not members, a full member of the Jewish people, etc. As we explained, this is the consequence of the idea of being a heretic. But now he carries on and he says, who does this apply to? This is the Rambam, just for those who want the source, in chapter 3 of Hilchos Mamrim. Have a look there. He says, someone who denies the Torah Sheba'al Peh, in their thoughts or with words, and follows their own free thinking. However, and he says this is like the founders of the Sadducee sect, like Tzadok and Baisus. However, B'nei HaTorim Ha'elah, those who are the children of their followers. So Tzadok and Baisus, who founded the sect that broke away from what we would nowadays call orthodoxy, these are heretics. Those who chose to follow them and desert orthodoxy, these are heretics. However, what about their children who are brought up in this sect, this breakaway group, this reforming group? What's their status? He says these are brought up with these wrong beliefs, and they simply don't engage in serious consideration of the alternative and engage in Shava. He says, Harehu ka'onus. This person has the halachic status of an onus, the third category of mistake that we spoke about. Not the person who deliberately drives the car, not the person who carelessly does, but the one who is completely not culpable for the act. Why? Because all they're doing is they're clinging to the way of their ancestors. And he says, it's appropriate to engage in kiruv, and to try and bring them back with ways of peace, until they return back to Torah. But in the meantime, he says, they are katinuk shenishma ben agoyim. They're like a child who is captured amongst the nations. Okay, so here the Rambam introduces a very, very important concept. The source of the concept, as with so much else in the Rambam, is based on the Gemara. This is a Gomorian Shabbos. And the Gomorian Shabbos is talking about not beliefs, but about chilul Shabbos, breaking and keeping Shabbos. And the halacha is that if you know about Shabbos, and you know about the transgressions of Shabbos, but you forget that today is Shabbos. So it's Saturday today, and you don't realize, you think it's Wednesday, and you don't realize it's Shabbos, and you do 15 different malachas on this Shabbos, you're only chayiv one chatos, you've made one shogeg, one mistake, which is you didn't realize it was Shabbos today. If, however, you know it's Shabbos today, but you forget 15 different malachas and you do them, then those are 15 mistakes you have to bring big chatos. In the context of that discussion, at the beginning of the 7th chapter of Masechah Shabbos, the Gemara says it's possible that you have an overarching mistake, in which only one error is made. And this is a tinuk shenishba ben agoyim, a child who was raised in a completely non-Jewish environment, never heard of Judaism. He was captured as a little baby and brought up in the middle of nowhere. When Mashiach comes, how many chatos is this child going to have to bring? Surely several thousands or tens of thousands for all the various sins they've done. Says the Gemara, or according to one reading of the Gemara, there's a possibility that they only bring one chatos, because there's one mistake that's gone on over here. They were too much they didn't know anything about anything. The Rambam transfers this concept to the world of belief and says someone who is a heretic, but they are only a heretic because they just simply didn't know anything. They're not Baisus and Tzadok. They're not the founding fathers of the Sadducee movement. They're not even their students who choose to adopt it and join the sect. But they're simply kids brought up in this breakaway reforming group. They are tinuk shenishma ben agoyim. They're little child captured, and therefore not culpable at all for their heresy, and they don't have the status of a heretic. Now the question over here is, how do these two ideas fit? We've got the Reb Chaim, who argues in the Rambam that the whole concept of heresy is, it's not about culpability, it's not about guilt, it's about an existential reality. And on the other hand, we have this Rambam over here, which does seem to say there's a concept of onus, of not being guilty or responsible for one's mistaken beliefs. And by the way, this later Rambam is a great relief, because then it turns out that those who are innocently non-believers, because they haven't been raised in those values or whatever it may be, are certainly not included in the category of heretics, because they didn't know, they simply didn't realize. So how do we resolve and put these two Rambams together? I want to take this further action. Anthony made an excellent point in the chat comment that he posted. He says that Olam Haba, according to the Rambam, is nothing more than staying everything that one's learned in spirituality. So by definition, if you haven't learned, there will not be an Olam Haba for you. And that's an absolutely correct summary of why the Rambam and how the Rambam says this view. When we discussed the earlier part of this series, Olam Haba, we explained that according to the Rambam, this is part of the reality of what you've created for yourself. So it makes absolute sense that someone, for the formulation of a crime, that Nebuch, the Apikoros, the person who isn't responsible for what they've done, is nonetheless a heretic, because the Rambam understands Olam Haba to be part of your existential reality, part of the spiritual reality you've created for yourself. In fact, interestingly, both the Rambam and the Kabbalists agree with this. They both agree it's not about just an arbitrary sort of reward and punishment system. It's about what you've built of yourself. And we discussed this at length when we spoke about schar mitzvah, the rewards for the mitzvahs, the mitzvah itself, the effect it has on you, how it molds you into being certain sort of person. And even the Kabbalists and the rationalists agree on this. This isn't a subject of debate. They simply argue over how it molds and forms you into a certain sort of person. The Rambam says it molds you in terms of your consciousness and your way of thinking, and the Kabbalists say it molds you in some supernatural way, and it has a spiritual effect on you. The Kabbalists give more importance to the spiritual impact of mitzvahs performed, even unthinkingly. The Rambam says it's about your conscious awareness of what the mitzvahs do for you. But it's absolutely correct to say that they both agree with the concept of a spiritual reality which you have created for yourself. And that's why, in this respect, the view of the Rambam of the concept of principle of faith eventually took over the whole of the Jewish world, because it's an idea that can be agreed upon by everyone, even though the Kabbalists put more of a stress on actions and less on belief and so on. But they could all agree to the idea that the reality of what you've made of yourself has this effect on you. So how can the Rambam then say that this tinuk shenishba, this child has been brought up, captured, honors, we accept, not in the least guilty for their decisions, but nonetheless a non-believer? What does it mean to say that they are not in the category of a non-believer because they were tinuk shenishba? And one way of formulating the answer, there's many answers to this question. One answer to the question could be that the Rambam agrees that this person has no portion in the world to come. He simply means in the halachic system of how we treat them, we don't treat them as a heretic since there was no choice that was made. However, there's I think a deeper and more profound answer, which it happens to be a very precious answer to me because I heard it from my Rabbi, Rabbi Yitzchak Soloveitchik, and I think it's a very important point. And the point he asked is, what would the Rambam say? And this is such an interesting discussion to ask a Maimonidean, someone who is a full believer in the Rambam system. What would the Rambam say? Imagine the scene. I'm standing there at a bris or a kiddush on the birth of a little baby, and I turn to the father or the mother, and I say, Mazel Tov on the birth of your baby. It's a pity that your child is a heretic. So they say, excuse me, what exactly do you mean? Well, I say this baby is 8 days old at the moment now. I assume they don't believe in the 13 principles of faith of the Rambam. I mean, are they able to consciously assert animamin be'emunah shlema in the 13 principles of faith? Absolutely not. So this child isn't a heretic. I mean, will the Rambam apply the laws of heresy to such a child? This is ridiculous. Would this not be a member a member of Klal Yisrael in the fullest extent, because this child isn't a believer? So the argument goes that clearly, even the Rambam would acknowledge that the concept of believer or non-believer only clicks into effect, only makes sense, once you have someone who is weighing up the two possibilities and able to weigh up two possibilities and comes to a formulation and a determination. If a person is completely unconscious, unaware of the issue, then the category of believer and non-believer doesn't make sense. The concept of believer and non-believer is just someone who is debating and weighing up and considering different belief systems. If I neither believe or disbelieve, because I'm simply not aware of the topic in any meaningful way, this isn't what the Rambam is referring to when he talks about believers and non-believers. A tinuk, a child, literally, a baby, literally, these concepts don't apply to. These terms don't make any coherent sense. And this is the concept, the root behind the idea of a tinuk shenishba, a child who is captured. The idea is this is someone who remains their whole life in this childlike state of innocence with reference to the deep concepts of the 13 principles of faith. This child who's captured never seriously thought about belief in Moshe or not Moshe, because they never heard of Moshe, they didn't know about Moshe. They grew up in Outer Mongolia, they never knew anything about the whole idea. They're not someone who's made their decision. Perhaps they grew up in a pagan environment, when no one's ever seriously considered the possibility of monotheism. Not everyone is an Avram or Yisro who's capable of rising above that. So it's not that they've weighed up two possibilities and considered the pros and cons of monotheism and rejected it. They simply haven't considered that possibility in any serious way. And therefore, this person remains with the status of their tinner, and they are as much a heretic as the baby of 8 days old trying to apply a halachic category to such a child. This is ridiculous. Of course you can't. The extension of the Rambam in Hilchos Mamrim is so too someone who grows up in a Jewish environment, but they are descendants of a particular school of thought. Their parents or grandparents joined this reforming sect of Tzaddik or Baisus. They mix the whole time with Jews. This is the reality. If you're living in the Rambam's world in Egypt and Fustat, you've got Karaites and what we would call Orthodox Jews living side by side, mixing the whole time. We're not talking about someone growing up in Outer Mongolia. Says the Rambam, even such a person can be a Tinuk Shenishba. Because most people just go with the school of thought that they're brought up with. There are rare and exceptional individuals who we should absolutely salute, who are brought up in one value system and are able to shift to another value system. Bali Tshuva, people that make changes in their life, incredible, amazing. But you can't demand that of every human being. Most people grow up in a system and they never seriously consider other possibilities. Such a person, says the Rambam, is a Tinuk Shenishba, even though they know that their next door neighbor goes every week to shul on Shabbos and doesn't do things, and holds very different beliefs to them. But they never seriously consider that possibility, even if they engage in some conversation with that neighbor, but they never seriously consider that possibility. It's out of the box, it's interesting, it's a cultural phenomenon, the Jews that do other things. This remains a Tinuk Shenishba in the argument of the Rambam. So what the Rambam has done is, with one hand, he's taken a very strong stance, the concept of the 13 principles of faith, true to his existential understanding, as Anthony pointed out, that Ono Abba is a reality, a metaphysical reality, not arbitrary, it's not just something given or not given. Equally, he's true to his understanding that Torah, the depth of Torah and relationship to God is about philosophical belief, which is very controversial, about which the Kabbalists absolutely disagree. But being a heretic is not about guilt and responsibility. As Rabbi correctly said, Nebuch and Apikoros is also an Apikoros, because you don't have that metaphysical reality on the one hand. On the other hand, the Rambam accepts that there are people who simply haven't significantly engaged with ideas, such that they've never seriously considered the possibilities either way. It's just not been on their intellectual horizon to think seriously about this. We all understand that with a baby, literally, stage 1, the Tinuk, the literal baby. The Gemara extends it to Tinuk Shenishba Bein Ha'amim, to the child who's brought up in Outer Mongolia who never meets a Jew, stage 2. The Rambam extends it to stage 3, to a child who grows up in Fustat in Egypt, mixing with from Jews. However, he is a follower of the Karaites, and therefore doesn't see a reason to question his belief. He just goes with that. That's what he's been brought up with. That's what he knows. So the Rambam, this person is also someone who never seriously considered the alternative possibility, and therefore this person is also not a heretic. Why are they not a heretic? Surely we said that this is about metaphysical reality. Surely we said this is about Nebuch, even someone who isn't responsible. The answer is that refers to someone who weighs up, who considers, who's in the topic. But if the terms are meaningless to them, it's never been something they've considered at all, then this is like the child who doesn't have that system with which to consider the term. And if you say to that person, do you believe or don't you believe in God? I don't know what the meaning of this word is. I've never considered it properly. That the Rambam would agree is not a heretic, is not a kafir. So we've run out of time now. I'm going to pause just for a few minutes in case there are any questions. Otherwise, we'll stop here for today, and Emir Hashem will carry this on next week to see how the great poskim have applied this to contemporary scenarios, which are much more wishy-washy. We're aware that there are many people who do grow up in a form environment and nonetheless make different choices. How does that fit in with the formulation of Tinuk Shenishba in the thinking of the Rambam? I'll just pause in case there are any questions.
So I have a question which is about the consequences of all this, because what we're saying with the Rambam is that your Olam Haba is your intellectual creation and level. Are we saying that a Tinuk Shenishba gets it for free? Are they, like, if you can't take your A levels, they assessed how have you behaved on your own moral level in this life? If you can't take your A levels, we'll look at your coursework and assess from there. what does the Tanakh Nishma get with all this? What are the consequences of it in Olam Haba? What is their Olam Haba?
Okay, this is a good question, and there's two possible answers to this question. Point number one is, the Rambam may think there's some sort of basic premise of belief for the person who hasn't thought about it. And therefore, even though the person is saying consciously, I don't believe in this, nonetheless, there is an inner sense in which that's simply because they've never thought about it. But since were they to think about it seriously, they would emerge as believers, that would be sufficient. In which case, the Rambam is agreeing with an idea of some sort of a potential belief as being sufficient. And there are indications of the Rambam to this, or some sort of inner goodwill or inner belief. This is possibility number one in the Rambam. This finds expression in I don't want to go into this in too much detail, maybe next week we can discuss it in more detail. A very famous psak of the Rambam, again based on the Gemara, but the Rambam gives it a certain application. The very brief halacha is as follows. In halacha, and this is part of a broader discussion about the aguna issue, a get cannot be forced. It has to be given with free will. A divorce, a get. Nonetheless, the Rambam says that we can compel someone to give a get in the point in history when Beis Din had authority, even by threatening lashes and punishment. And when the person gives such a get, this is considered a get given with goodwill, because we understand that this is the intrinsic desire of the person to behave decently and honorably in line with Torah. And it's simply their, selfishness or ego or anger that's getting in the way. And therefore, now that they're compelled to give the get, they are in accordance with it, and that's what they really want to do. So it may be that the Rambam has some view that there's a sort of inner belief that exists. Alternatively, this ties into the view of the Rambam of Tchias HaMesim, which we looked at, in which the Rambam sees Tchias HaMesim as a chance for everyone to acquire Olam Haba, even those who never had the chance previously. So this child who dies at a month old and therefore never became a believer, or this child who dies at 120 and never became a believer because they grew up as part of the Sadducees or the Karaites, maybe the Rambam would say, since they haven't rejected it, they therefore will get the chance in Tchias HaMesim. Because after all, this is what the Rambam said Tchias HaMesim is about. Tchias HaMesim is about the chance for those who were too busy in their lives to ever become philosophically inclined and end up as people who could have an intellectual and philosophical relationship with God. So those are two possible ways of understanding this idea in the Rambam. But either way, I think as a neutral reading of the Rambam, it's a very good reading. And I therefore don't think that some of the extensions of Tanakh Nishma, which the modern posts can apply, and we will see how they apply this to scenarios of the 21st century, I don't think this is some form of apologetics. I think it is true to the Rambam. And please God, we'll look at that next week.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure, and I wish you all a good day. Thank you so much, as always, for joining.
Thank
Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you from Hendon.
Zobin.
Thank you for Yerushalayim.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.